If you're going to write a book, one of the things you should consider is if you should have a dynamic character or a static character. My name is Mark J. Gregson. I'm an author, and my book, Sky's End, is getting published by Peachtree Teen in spring of 2024. I'm also an English teacher. This is the fourth part of my running series on writing a novel. If you haven't followed me already, give me a follow and check out the other videos. Now, when you're creating a character, you might want to decide between whether your character is going to be a dynamic character or a static character. Dynamic characters are characters who evolve and change. The story changes who they are. So by the end of the story, they're completely different. Samwise Gamgee is a great example of a dynamic character. Think about who he is at the beginning in Hobbiton in the Shire, and by the end, he's like this warrior. Static characters, however, are characters who largely stay the same. They are always who they are. This doesn't mean they're not complex, but they largely stay the same. Here's a list of some examples of dynamic characters. Walter White, for example, from the Breaking Bad series, he's definitely very different by the end. Ebenezer Scrooge, very different from the beginning of the story versus the end of the story. The Beast in The Beauty and the Beast, very different, changed by the end of the story. Katniss Everdeen in The Hunger Games absolutely has changed and evolved. On the flip side, here are some of our examples of static characters. You got Batman, James Bond, Sherlock Holmes, and Alice in Wonderland. Each of these characters largely stay the same. Yes, there are some differences, and they might change a little bit, but when you go to a Batman film, you're going to see Batman. Superman's another example. He's generally going to be just Superman, right? Same thing with Sherlock Holmes. You read a Sherlock Holmes book, Sherlock Holmes is always going to be Sherlock Holmes. Thing also to consider if you're writing a dynamic character is that they tend to lend themselves really well to a series, like a story, like a trilogy that goes from beginning to end. Whereas a static character tends to have individual stories. It doesn't mean you can't have a series of them, but they're more individually and self-contained stories. For example, it's probably easier to jump into the middle of the James Bond series of movies, the 007 movies, just in the middle. Whereas if you jump into the middle of the second Hunger Games, it's probably going to be harder to pick up on. Really depends on what you want your story to be and what you want your character to be. There's no right or wrong answer here. Just ask yourself, do you want your character to learn something, to grow and become something new by the end? Or do you want him to largely stay the same?